Welcome to this panel entitled Restoring and Creating Connections. My name is Aboubakar Sanogo, and it's a great pleasure for me to be moderating this panel in the second consecutive day of a reflection on the archive, the archival, and its implications, both for Africa and sorry, I have to turn off my sound from my YouTube here because I always forget to do this. There we go. All right, sorry. So as part of our conversation around reframing the idea of the archive, the practices of the archive, the approaches to the archive, starting from Africa and or in relation to Africa. Yeah. I was very inspired by the previous panel, I have to say, and the multiplicity of topics that they raised, and in particular, I think the notion, as we look obviously at the archival, of this idea of a certain right to opacity, the right to opaqueness or to opacity, which has been really well conceptualized in other contexts, and which obviously is something that should also be part of our arsenal of approach of a kind of epistemology of the archival. Now, in the context of our panel, we are trying to both see what to do with legacies passed on to us, either in the context of a personal, intimate relationship, and the idea of what to do with simply with the archive of fantastic photographic archives bequeathed onto us, which is, if I resonates with some of the conversations we've been having a lot since yesterday around precisely the question of the papers slash productions of our filmmakers, of our photographers, and so on. I think you might recall the debate we had on Sembene and the archives of Sembene and what it means for them to be now in Indiana, outside of the continent, and so on. So I think I feel that some of the conversations might resonate in some ways with that. And so our first, so we have our first panelist will be Robyn Aronstam, who will be precisely talking about a treasure trove, simply, of archival material that were left behind, and who's trying to figure out, in fact, what to do with it, which is a broader question. This is a continent-wide question, so to speak. I was actually, in listening to some of the conversations yesterday, thinking about Akomfra and Jihan. I was thinking, what exactly are their plans for their papers at this particular moment? I am not quite sure. Well, it's one of the questions that I might have asked as them. We have, so our second panelist is Simon Bright, who is a filmmaker from Zimbabwe, who really was a major figure in African cinema. Still is a major figure, but we haven't heard too much from him, let's say, in the past fairly, the 2 decades, I have to say, in terms of film production and so on, but was really very important at a particular moment in African cinema where there was a sense that things were beginning to happen in the Southern African region. I remember that very, very distinctly, that moment when people like Idrissa Ouedraogo, Suleiman Cissé, Gaston, Yvonne Kabore, Fepasi, there was a kind of southward move of African cinema at that moment. Jean-Pierre Bekolo, obviously. So a number of filmmakers were trying to see what can be done to decenter, if you will, certain practices of African cinema. And Zimbabwe at the time played an extremely important role. It has not since maybe Simon's departure. But it was certainly a key place. I literally distinctly remember how, in fact, it undid the careers of some filmmakers. When you think about people like Idrissa Ouedraogo, for example, and the move toward making films in English in Southern Africa had some backfired on some of the connection, let's say, in with the old colonial masters in France, for example. Our third presenter, Fibby Kioria, is unfortunately not yet with us. We're trying really hard to connect with her. She's in Kenya. And she's a curator, works with Maisha Lab, has been on multiple juries, and would have really brought us, and would, we're still waiting for her to come, brought out some of her experience in, let's say, curating a series of continent or region-wide screening, such as the Sembene across Africa, which started 3 days ago and is still going on today, actually. I'm actually supposed to be on one of those sessions after this panel. And on what you call the Manyatta screening, which you organized during the lockdown. So I was very much looking forward to also looking at these new practices, exhibition practices in the online context. But for now, I'm going to go back to our panelists. So we're going to start with Robyn Aronstam. And the title of the presentation is In Search of an Archive.
Many thanks, Aboubakar, and I'm honored to join this panel discussion. I've worked in film since the 1980s, and in those trenches, I've made documentaries. I've made documentaries for trade unions. I production managed the official ANC history Ulibambalinga Shoni in 1992. Also written and directed for local TV. And then went into feature filmmaking as a script supervisor, making films around the world. I never realized when I was doing these just how important it would be to look at an archive for these works. In those days, you were lucky enough if you came away with a VHS with your film on that you'd worked on. And then when it progressed to perhaps CDs, and now perhaps a digital section on your own computer, where you're fortunate enough to collect your work digitized. It's only in this period now when I'm actually engaging with a body of work that has been left to me that I've suddenly come to realize the implications as a filmmaker, but not just making, but actually preserving. So I'd like to share some of the pictures of Henyan Han. They would have been clips probably from his film, Letter to My Cousin in China, which addresses so many of these issues so cogently and artistically. However, we're on film unfriendly Zoom, as we've discovered. So I'm going to at least show some of his photos from his collection on his mother. Henky, if you could bring those up, please. Are they up? Yes, okay, perhaps we're just not seeing them on YouTube. We're on Zoom, okay. So Henyan Han was born in Johannesburg in 1952 to immigrant Chinese parents. I think in that first pic, I'm not sure where you are in pic 1, you'll see a baby Henyan with his mum. And then in the second pic, you'll see the Han family. Henyan was the first son after 3 girls. They were so excited they tried again, got another boy. And then when the 6th daughter came, I believe they stopped. His father worked at the Taiwanese consulate and had a passion for 8mm home movies. Henyan belonged to the Market Photo Workshop, and he also worked for Pro Color in Braamfontein. And that's where he met David Goldblatt, who really promoted Henyan's artistry and became a form of a mentor to Henyan. I trust that we're now in the photos, perhaps at number 4 or 5, Hanky, somewhere around there, where we see the series on his mother that he shot in the 80s during her last years when he took care of her. She suffered from what was labeled in those times as manic depression. And I think that you'll find that these photos are representative of a larger sense than just of his mother, but of a space, a diaspora lost in the world that they may have found themselves in. Henyan taught at Wits, which is where I met him in the 80s. And then he went on to a Fulbright from the Art Institute of Chicago, where he received his MFA. He came back to South Africa. He directed documentaries, a great one on James Coetzee, and he became a very respected film editor. A lot of people consider him the expert on Mandela footage, archives, as he's worked on many of those films. His acclaimed documentary, Letter to My Cousin in China, is a film about his family, his identity, his first generational need to trace his beginnings and his endings, and about the importance of burying the dead. Are we done with the photos, Hanky? Still going? Good. If you'll just go through those in terms of some kind of contextual placement around Henion's work from his mother's series. So when Henion died in 2018 from cancer, he left me his body of work. We had spent many hours together by that time, ordering his photos for the retrospective that he wanted so badly. I'm grateful that he was with me in terms of looking at his timeline of his life and his work. After Henion's death, I contacted several of his colleagues, some of them who worked at institutional archives, and I was pretty shocked that the pictures looked pretty grim around what we could do with his work. There appeared no obvious space nor money for exhibitions. No one was especially keen or could promise that his negs wouldn't end up stacked in the basement somewhere. There was a sense of overwhelmment around looking after people's work. Institutional archiving facilities seemed stuck and struggling to create that living space for the image, whether it be photographic or moving. So, as filmmakers do, I worked on making a plan. There always has to be a plan about the image. And usually the greater plan needed is about how to bring that image into being. And now I was confronting what do you do with an image that is there and has no access. So a close friend and colleague, Christo Doherty, an admirer of Henion's work, was very valuable in terms of discussing and engaging in it with me. And we realized even though Henion may not be there to appreciate and enjoy an exhibition, that was our first route of possibility. Christo contacted the Wits Art Museum, and luckily both Julia and Fiona knew Henion's work and were admirers of it. So it was very gratifying when WAM agreed to a show of Henion's work. Christo and I decided that we would curate the best of Henion's photos, as well as show Letter to My Cousin in China and several other short films in a black box within the exhibition space. So we plunged into the difficult questions around crowdfunding, silver gelatin prints, dates, other pragmatics, and then COVID arrived. And with it, the sense of absurdity of spending so much on an exhibition that, especially in COVID times, had limited viewing and attendance, and which would also ultimately end up being stored somewhere underground. Just a PS is that later in COVID times, I would see well-resourced museums able to do massive digitization and put out exhibitions and viewings and open access to the work. For example, the Frida Kahlo online exhibition that Google Arts and Culture managed to do. So it was a fairly easy and seamless swap for Christo and I to speak about making a book of Henion's work. It would allow us additional input around writings, and we would still find a way to do a giveaway of the films. And it's something that I still plan to do. However, all roads seem to have led back to some larger essential questions about where does work go once it's made, and its maker, the driving force, is gone. How does it endure? How does it persist? How does it fill in the narratives of our lives and our identity? So, as I've said, as an on-set filmmaker, those weren't my preoccupations. But now I was faced with the basic questions of how to digitize, how to capture the work, then how and where to save it. And all avenues in this process of dealing with an artist's estate led back to the essential conversation around digitization, storage, and then access, or more accurately, as I came to discover, the lack of it. So then it became about restoring and creating connections, the very theme of this panel. The option of commercial skilled companies that digitize the negatives is attractive, but it's very expensive, and it feels like a step further down the line when looking to print selected photos. So we started to ask ourselves, what happens if we manage to raise money from philanthropic friends, family overseas? What happens if we buy the scanner? We hire someone skilled to scan Henion's negatives. We could pre-sell the book, and in the process, we would be creating his archive. But I think what kind of knocked me over then is, but then what do we do with it? Where does it go to then? So questions arose. Do we need to reinvent the collective model to create new platforms for sustainable, profitable archival portals? The answer was hell yes. So yes, there are historical archives that have absorbed individuals' work, but those are mainly around the dominant narrative. And that's all well and good. We are happy and they are incredibly useful. But there are so many other images and stories needing a home. I think the thing that hit me really strongly is that photos need to belong somewhere to find a context for their preservation. And then I started asking myself, could we create this context through a repository? So I started looking around and speaking to people engaged in this process. I spoke to Tracy Marinek, a curator, writer, and art historian, and she inspired me greatly when she shared her impressive proposal that she'd already put out there for an archive. So she argues that much of the 80s and 90s work has been overlooked and is vulnerable to loss. These are other key narratives, fuller versions of stories, other voices that through the lack of resources and structures may disappear. Tracy has done great work with that. She conceived of possible connections with other archives. She incorporated skills development, mentorship, training, and even with such an excellent, well-situated proposal, she still had no luck. I struggled to understand it, and I asked Tracy to help me break down the challenges into a filmmaker's language that I could understand. What do you need for an archive? She told me, a scanner, a computer, cloud storage, external drive, skilled person, possibly rent. Could it be that easy? I wondered. Fortunately, the answer is not really. Engagement around possible models present more questions than answers, but they're good questions. They're questions that are worthwhile on a panel like this investigating. About an inter-archival system, forming alliances with others in our situation, many on our continent, to create the spaces, the pockets, the shelves for a Southern African repository where we embed our stories, our images, our films, our publications, our exhibitions. This could be a hold-all. It was open to shaping and experimentation. With the people who were still living, we could do interviews, we could do discussions, we could record those, we could have a background to so much of the material that wouldn't be there when you are rescuing archives from people who have gone on already. I was greatly liberated by Jihanel Tari in her presentation yesterday, when she was speaking of a source in which we don't get bogged down by the legal and copyright issues, a post-colonial space, conscious and all-encompassing rather than strict categorization. I mean, surely we can hashtag the hell out of every entry and connect the dots in a myriad of ways. We can shape the landscape that we want to inhabit. What about just getting it out? Not for nothing. Different memberships, different subscription models, different avenues of exploitation, different revenue models. If the images are used for profit, then deliver a share for the resources used. I mean, doesn't Shutterstock manage that? Do we rent space from Amazon or Microsoft or Google, but purchase our own server and backup? Do we find a host? Do we pay developers? Do we pay for traffic and a domain name? Do we outsource it? Or do we develop in-house collectives that find a way to do all of these things? I know about the battle to reshape intellectual property. I mean, these days you can pirate anything, anywhere. What is out there seems to belong to us all. And what is ownership in a digital world fit to burst with content? Is there another way to look at it? So what I came away with is that we can work on the structure and the rules if there's the passion and the need for it. But if we get bogged down, then nothing will birth. So what may start as a collective or an NGO has the potential through its shaping to extend into monetization, breakaway shoots of different companies that form a larger body of the work. Yes, archives may not have fared well in universities. Perhaps it's been problems of centralized financing or university politics. And yes, some NGOs left the universities, but many are now going back as it's cold out there. So does one perhaps register as an NPO, non-profit organization, ingest the work, set up various fundraising measures, include competitions, talent spotting, makers out there, their reward being the housing of their work on the server? Do we perhaps set up a public benefit organization with SARS, our revenue collection service? Do we aim to raise money from international funding, from academic institutions? I've been engaging with an academic, Ruth Simbao, who's doing incredible work in the Africa-China connection. And in one of her books now, in a book now, she has a chapter on Henion's film, Letter to My Cousin in China. And I'm so mortified at how many questions she asks me that I don't know the answer about. But I also know that were there some funds or resources, I could gather that through his family, through the Chinese community in Johannesburg. We could be expanding and growing it into something useful for everybody. I think that also if we set up a conservation center, it can still branch out into commercializing aspects of that library, so that ultimately we create our own sphere of images with allies sharing the same continent and similar histories. I'm really reassured by the intrinsic link to my co-panelists. I'm connected to Simon's experience by having cut my teeth making films in Zimbabwe and Mozambique in the 80s, by getting a sense that it wasn't only the Canon films in South Africa that were to be my métier, but also that there was the possibility of shooting in different ways. And I work with Fibby. She works with Maisha as well, with Mira, and we have those possibilities. So just in conclusion, I'm seized by these thoughts of working on exhuming what could be lost. A mirroring of Henion's work that literally captures the exhumation of his mother's bones in a family's pursuit of identity and belonging. And now I seek, alongside others, the urn, the crucible, the landscape that will allow for a living archive. And as John Afkomfra said yesterday, and it resonated so deeply, in the absence of other tangible evidence, I'm seeking its home. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It obviously opens up a lot of things, but since we are pressed with time, I'm going to move on directly to Simon, and then I will come back with the questions. Simon, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Aboubakar, and hello to Robyn. I thought that was a very inspiring speech, Robyn. You touched, well, you created a number of very interesting possibilities for for keeping our archive alive, and especially on the African continent. But anyway, firstly, I must really appreciate the work of Pervaiz and Cynthia for this very interesting seminar and for bringing people together in this way. My talk is about the transformative power of archive and the way that it triggered transnational Southern African cinema in the 1980s and 1990s. This movement has been forgotten since then, but its history remains in memory and in the archives, of course. In 1980, two events changed the face of Southern Africa. First, Zimbabwe achieved majority rule, and the second for me was when I watched a film called Pamberi in Zimbabwe. It was about the Zimbabwean election. When Zimbabwe became independent at that time, it is easy to forget the huge impact that it had on the whole region, enabling the creation of the Southern African Development Coordination Community, or SADCC. This regional union created the united framework needed to resist apartheid. It inherited the legacy of the frontline states and their solidarity faced by the terrific abuses and attacks of apartheid. The member states, especially Angola, played a key role in the liberation of Namibia and the final overthrow of apartheid. And this, in a way, is a history that's also been forgotten. But remember at that time that films about the independence struggles in Southern Africa and all over Africa were dominated by the style and perspectives of Western news, of BBC, indeed of Rhodesian film crews. So when I came to see Pamberi in Zimbabwe, it was a brilliantly fresh perspective on the fragile ceasefire and ending Zimbabwe's war of liberation. It gave voice to the leaders of the Patriotic Front. It showed the extraordinary melding of the warring factions, as well as the drama of the election itself. The idioms and styles of the music vividly helped to dramatize the clash of cultures and ideologies that the Rhodesian Zimbabwean transition embodied, going from Chimurenga choirs to Bob Marley's Freedom Song, and via some rather sickly Rhodesian lounge music as well, to bring the spirit of the time. It was a regional co-production made by Mozambique and Angolan film institutes. The cameramen were João Costa from Mozambique, who I worked with for the next 20 years, and Carlos Enriquez from Angola, who has since sadly died. The perspectives of Pamberi were entirely different from that of any Western TV news or documentary. It was presented as a birthday present to the new Zimbabwe. Discovering this archival jewel of a film was as important to me on a number of different levels. It was a fine blend of third cinema documentary using local skills and resources of image and archive and fluent handheld guerrilla-style camera work. Its use of montage vividly demonstrated the clash of cultures and ideologies of the country transitioning from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. It showed that regional co-production with crews from different Southern African countries working together could produce a very powerful documentary. Pamberi is a unique Southern African film about our own political transition. No one else could have entered under the skin of these events in the way that this film and these filmmakers did. Representing the complex nuances and fragilities of the ceasefire, Pamberi also placed the story in a historical context, embracing pre-colonial history as well as the story of the election. It realized a key Pan-African goal made at the now forgotten 1977 Maputo African Conference on Cinema by advocating regional cooperation in production and distribution. So, inspired by this, combining our skills and resources against the very well-funded propaganda of apartheid was, we felt, probably the only way to develop cinema in our region. Together with Wilson Katio and Albert Chimedza, we organized the first Southern African Regional Film Workshop in Harare in 1984 to kickstart the new Zimbabwean film industry. Seeking the advice of our Pan-African colleagues, we invited Djibril Diop Mambete from Senegal, representing the FEPASI, and Haile Garima came from the US, and Pedro Pimenta came from Mozambique. Watching, could you show the first slide, please? Thank you, Hanky. Watching Djibril Diop Tuki Buki and Garima's harvest of 3,000 years, this was the first time Pan-African cinema had ever been shown in Zimbabwe. Out of this seminal encounter came the resolutions that laid the basis for future film festivals, beginning in the 1990 First Frontline Film Festival. We needed also some films of our own to show. I directed Corridors of Freedom, and I chose a SADC crew from Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Could we have slide number 2, please? So these were the same crew, apart from Martin Mahando from Tanzania, who had shot Pambera in Zimbabwe. Most anti-apartheid films at this time focused on how Black South Africans were being victimized by apartheid. But meanwhile, on the ground, there was an unreported regional anti-apartheid coalitions were forming that needed celebrating. We were filming in and about our own territories, and we knew how to navigate them, and we knew the story on the ground. My perspective was that faced by the horrific violence of South African destabilization, SADC's regional cooperation offered successful resistance. And I wanted to show that apartheid was going to fail, as it did. Our 2 cameramen were João Costa from Mozambique and Carlos Enriquez from Angola, the same who shot Pambera in Zimbabwe. Corridors was then the next step in the direction of a developing transnational filmmaking. We shared clear Pan-African goals for Southern Africa's future, and that helped in terms of the discussion and arguments that can break out in a crew. Can I show slide number 3, please? When completed, Corals of Freedom was distributed on TV from East Germany across Europe to Canada and PBS in the States. So the film also opened up international distribution for our embryonic transnational cinema. In the face of apartheid's successful and massively funded international propaganda campaign, Southern African filmmakers from Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe started work, and they produced great films like Maraquén, Borders of Blood, Destructive Engagement. These are some of the forgotten Southern African archives of the 1980s. The chain of reaction stemming from Pambera in Zimbabwe led on to the formation of the Zimbabwe Film and Video Association, chaired by the late Stephen Chifanisa, and we raised funds to organize the first Frontline Film Festival in 1990. Could I have slide 4, please? Many great names of African cinema attended. This was a bringing together of Pan-African heroes like Gaston Cabaret, Suleiman Cisse, Djibril Diop Mambete, as well as many filmmakers from the SADC region. Significantly, South African anti-apartheid filmmakers, as well as representatives of the ANC and PNC, also attended. These had been excluded by apartheid from the richness of Pan-African cinema, and the filmmakers were introduced to a vision of Africa beyond apartheid. Could I have slide number 5, please? This festival was followed by 3 more. and also the first African Input TV conference was held in Harare. To this conference came Maghrebian directors and producers like Dora Bushusha, as well as the new wave of West African directors such as Idrissa Wadriago and Jean-Pierre Bekolo. They came to Harare. It seems ironic now to call Idrissa the new wave of African filmmakers, but he was in those days. This became a creative cauldron for the new cinema of Southern Africa. These meeting across borders and language barriers opened up a rich slate of filmmaking, mixing styles from North, West, and Southern Africa in a truly Pan-African way, according to me. Directors came from other parts of Africa to shoot their films in Harare, as Aboubakar has mentioned earlier. Bekelo came from Cameroon and he made Aristotle's Plot. Wadriago came from Burkina and shot Kenyan Adams. Uzan Palsi came from Martinique with a Hollywood budget to make Dry White Season. And Raoul Peck shot his famous film Lumumba in Zimbabwe. I produced My Africa series with films by women directors from Tunisia, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa. And from that series, Fanta Nakra's film won a prize at Directors' Fortnight in Cannes. As the movement started maturing and apartheid was overthrown, the organization moved, called SACOD, running meetings and training programs throughout Southern Africa. And I want to stress really that in this limited amount of time, I can't do justice to all the achievements of the many other filmmakers who are working on Southern African projects in this rich period of time. So please forgive me if I've left you out. From watching the archive Pamberi near Zimbabwe in 1982, a chain of events gathered momentum which led to the flowering of an activist Southern African cinema in the 1990s, as the region was extricating itself from the death throes of apartheid. Could I have slide number 6, please?
Simon, so I'm going to butt in a little bit just because we are told that there's very little time left. So if you could wrap it up so that we can maybe throw out some of the major things out and then we'll come back with via the questions, if you don't mind. Yes, thanks.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to quote Gabriel Mondlane, chair of the Association of Mozambican Filmmakers, who confirmed this collaborative experience that I've described. Those days we knew each other's projects because we discussed them at Input SACOD and the festivals. We discussed films and helped criticize them. We helped directors to improve their stories before they raised money and before they began shooting. Today, people are not telling stories to each other because they think that their project ideas will get stolen. There is no trust between us because we have not been given the space to develop friendships or brothership. So, cutting to the chase, when I think of the healing, restorative, and recovery functions of archive, I realize that if one film can trigger the concept of transnational Southern African cinema, as I've suggested Pamberi in Zimbabwe did, is it not worth preserving the brilliant archives that exist in Harare, Maputo, Windhoek, and Luanda, not to mention South Africa? After all, we can't predict what future generations can do with this priceless material. Earlier in the year, I worked with UNESCO's regional office to begin to develop a project to support these national archives and to link them through a common website so they're accessible and usable. This is echoing some of the very important points that Robyn made. COVID stalled this project, which now needs to be revised. Key to any success is, I believe, to have the project owned by an alliance of filmmakers who use the material, academics who keep the history alive, and archivists who preserve the materials. without such a plan, archives going back as far as the 1930s in this region will surely disintegrate. At the moment, those archives are being kept alive by the heroic effort of people like Ivan Murambiwa at the National Archives of Zimbabwe, at the Maputo Archive, and in Namibia. But I fully endorse some of the very interesting ideas that Robyn was coming up with about, basically, if archives are not used, if there's no engagement, we need to find models of engagement which will actually generate a lot of activity and a lot of new films by the next generation of filmmakers. And if we don't do that, we'll cut them off from an incredible resource. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you, Robyn. This was really a fantastic presentations here that lead us towards the direction of really trying to set up, reinforce where it exists, imagine new ways, some form of archival infrastructure really across the continent, across the region where you are, but of course across the continent, and even in linking it to the diaspora. I should probably share with you at some point a text that I wrote maybe a year and a half ago. It's called Africa in the World of Film Archiving. It was published in the Journal of Film Preservation, and where I tried to precisely lay out some of the issues that you are mentioning, going obviously from the extreme fragility of the archives across the continent. So the two examples, your two examples are really metaphors for what happens literally in each and every region. I would even say to a large extent, even each and every country of our continent. And so part of the impetus behind the article was precisely to argue along the same line that we need to do something. But what I get from your presentations is actually, I mean, there's a question of what to do and how to do it in some way, because of course we have when we think about the archival in Africa, I think there's a number of let's say lenses through which we can think about them. You obviously have, let's say, state-related, institutional-related archives, so to speak, that are to a large extent managed by the National Archives, whether cinema-specific or just broadly national. But you also have, let's say, because of course there's often in the African continent, there still is obviously a kind of tension between the artists, the filmmakers, and the state, right? And there are ways in which the state archive is not always necessarily a home for such, certainly by the managers of the state, is not necessarily a home for let's say the archives of dissensus, if I may call them so. And so so in some ways, other forms of other format, other platforms must be found along the lines of what Robyn is mentioning, to really create maybe something more on a sort of collective mode of archival practice, to precisely preserve for future generations the fantastic work that has been done in terms of both domestic context, but also in terms of the Pan-African film archive. So very exciting conversation. So let me see if we have some questions here. So somebody said, is the digital the only way to actively, collectively make the archive a mode of practice? Can we find other embodied ways of archiving, of making and archiving alongside the digital? So this is obviously an important question for us, in particular since we are not, the digital, however accessible it is, also has, let's say, within it, a high degree of perishability, right? By the constant transformation that it goes through. And I think it sort of is a broader, I mean, we can link it to the specific presentations that we have, but also to the broader question of even more recent digital native practices of filmmaking that also need to find some form of home. And so if either of you or both of you would like to really address this question, is the digital the primary way forward here? What about also possibilities of the analog, so to speak, keeping in mind that the durability of analog is obviously well known, well sanctioned in this particular case.
I think it's hard for an artist to not want the best possible replication of their work. I think that given the amount of work, money, energy that goes into creating something, it becomes a priority that you do have the best possible medium for it to live in. And presently, that's what the digitization affords us. So it's also, I think, it equalizes things in a sense, in that there won't be some films that have a better locus or sense of space or belonging, but there is something that equalizes it also in terms of that in a repository. You will find work that can be used in any medium because the quality is sufficient around that. So I think in those ways, yes, I mean, as much as I believe that it would be fantastic to have a physical archives attached to whether it's an institution or whatever, where you could walk around and you could see the photos on the walls, and we're talking about a globalized world now where access is crucial in terms of that. So in my understanding is that, having looked at, with Henian's work, he was so engaged and involved. Before he left us, he went to Silvertone in Johannesburg and spent so much money, and the joy of perfecting the digital image, playing around with color and looks and works. So I think at the moment it does afford the best opportunity for archiving, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a problem with the analog. For example, in the archives in Harare, they don't have power the whole time, and so keeping film at the temperature it requires to be kept at on the African continent becomes a very expensive and space-consuming activity. I mean, it needs to be kept, but digital just opens up so many possibilities. And the interesting thing for me about digital, I've used archive in a number of ways from digital sources, whether they're from telephone cameras, sorry, which I did in my film about Mswati, or when I made the film about Mugabe. We were simply shooting off screens using a video camera, but nevertheless, the image, I could still use it and project it in a room full of 200 people. The image was still usable. There's different kind of textures that different qualities of source material give, of course. So a digitized film is going to look different from a mobile phone footage of a riot in Mbaban or a riot in the streets of Harare. And all of those things give the textures and qualities that are useful. I mean, as we did for the Mugabe film, I can now say this internationally. A friend was recording from the newscasts of Pockets Hill, ZBC in Harare, Mugabe's speeches. He was recording them onto DVDs, and those DVDs were then being shipped out undercover to us. And we were then copying them and using those speeches. We could never have got permission from pocket seal from the state television to copy Mugabe's speeches. We were pirating them, of course. But I'm just giving an example of the way that the digital facilitated a process to make a film possible. I felt needed to be made.
Excellent, excellent. This obviously we can go in multiple directions with this. I mean, in some ways, let's say the two are not, let's say, incompatible. I certainly believe that part of the question has to do with, I mean, there are different layers, obviously, to the question of preservation. The dialectic between preservation and access, durability and affordability as well, which is also not an important question. Not to mention, of course, I think one key question that Simon alluded to, which has to do with this question of, let's say, when it comes to the physical archive, the question, if you will, of energy on our continent, right? So the challenge of energy on our continent, and the fact that almost not a single country on our continent seems to be able to run electricity properly from east to west, north to south. We seem to be challenged at that level, while paradoxically being the most energy rich from the solar standpoint of view continent. And so it seems to me that sort of the archival, sort of part of the question of the archival is so multi-faceted in that way, and certainly might also imply issues of research and development, either on our part or with people across the world, etc., to see how one could further, if you will, tap into or multiply the possible effects of the of energy, and for also having actual physical spaces where these archives could be kept, just in case Google goes down, for example, or the online world decides, Facebook collapse, etc., that we still have ways in which we are not really only, let's say, in debt, so to speak, to huge commercial entities that obviously would also have ways of commercializing archival work and so on and so forth. I would like to put in another question from the audience before we finish, because we have only 3 minutes. I see that. Or 9 minutes, I'm told. Okay. So why do institutions not further support the practical efforts of archiving rather than create contemporary work or focus on the more theoretical? Yeah. So they seem, apparently, according to the question, a certain tendency to emphasize the now, the contemporary.
So to get to the now, I mean, also it's something I've been thinking about deeply. And as much as in the beginning it seems like pipe dreams and all of that, I think that's where it starts. And I think that we're in a fortunate position that with the recognition of the global South, we have the promise of alliances that we haven't had before, an understanding of how much they can give us. And I was thinking back also to in the 80s when we were having similar conversations in like the Film and Allied Workers Organization, when we were looking at models like with French cinema, how at every ticket that was sold at the cinema, there was a levy that went towards the production of local films. And I'm wondering about whether it's through the NFVF in South Africa, the Department of Arts and Culture, any institution, any project that comes to shoot here internationally, what about a line item that is 0.5% of the budget or whatever it may be, goes towards the archiving, a living archive, something that whereby what you have used and what you have experienced here gets regenerated, a repository is formed, and it's for your benefit as filmmakers, as students, as your children one day who want to look at your work. So initially, I do think that there is something to be looking at reframing our minds as filmmakers, just like I've had to, from coming on set where you don't think about those things, to a situation where I'm looking for films to show my students, and I'm searching short films under 24 minutes and that, and I'm like, how come that someone hasn't cashed in by like buying, housing, getting those films, charging a membership fee, giving it to institutions at this rate or whatever, something along those lines. And I do think there's something worth looking at there, but there's going to have to be a superhuman drive, and I think it's going to have to come from all of us on the continent.
Well, I second what Robyn says there about the importance of thinking deeply about and going beyond thinking, actually. And this is going to bring me on to a question that I'd like to put to you, Aboubakar, about the ways to carry forward this archival project. I mean, there have been some very interesting possibilities discussed today in our panel. And I'm sure that you, Aboubakar, are also working on some, well, I know that you're working actively, very actively, to conserve West African cinema, at least. So after the seminar is finished and the excitement has died down, Aboubakar, what will you be doing, and what will Wits University be doing, and about helping us actually carry this forward, picking up the strands with UNESCO regional office, for example, putting some of Robyn's ideas down on paper and building those consortiums, which we already have. In a sense, those consortiums are a revival of the collaboration that existed in the 80s and 90s. So that I'm still in touch with Gabriel Mondlane. He's one of my really good friends in Mozambique. I'm in touch with Angolan archive through Bridget Pickering. We've got access to the Namibian archive. You've basically got a grassroots network ready at your disposal. Which way are you going to take it, Aboubakar?
No pressure.
Challenge, eh? You said I hadn't been doing anything in 10 years.
Here are a few pointers. I think that one of the reasons, if you will, that we are having Reframing Africa in South Africa is precisely, I think one of the reasons is that, at least infrastructurally speaking, it seems to be slightly doing better than many of our other countries to some extent. And you mentioned Wits. I think one of the things that I would like to see personally would be, let's say, if we were to take, let's say, the papers of South African cinema, just without even going beyond, and potentially opening up to the region, but let's say South African cinema. If there could be, because Wits hosts, if my memory is correct, the Mandela archives and many other archives, surely they could take care of the papers of South African filmmakers. So if there could be a kind of wing within Wits that would open up to welcoming this, because it's 125 years of film history in this, in this country. Yeah, that would welcome them, including the work of Ngakane himself, a student of Wits, Robyn's partner who taught at Wits. So the Wits connections are so multiple that there's hardly an argument to make about the need for the university to engage, really take Reframing Africa very seriously as an invitation to broaden up its understanding of the archive, of let's say the paper side of the archival, by including the cinematic. And so we started having a few conversations around it, but I think we should push it further. And one of the things that I said, I recall at the beginning, at the end of our first Reframing Africa, which was 2017, is really that we create we are if in effect a lobby now. Reframing Africa can in effect be a lobby now, because we have a significant mass or group of people involved from South Africa, from the rest of the continent, from the diaspora, with different positions. We have archivists, we have filmmakers, we have academics, we have historians, etc. We have curators, should I say. And so that itself can become now a sort of a Reframing Africa pro-archival lobby, so to speak, that could articulate the concerns of the archival to various entities. So we can talk about, let's say, the South African State, National Film and Video Foundation, the National Archives of South Africa, which exists, were part of the panel, one of the panels last year. And so we should follow up with that. There's no reason why the National Archives should be primarily the archives of the state. In other words, there should be a place for individual filmmakers, collective, etc. So the kind of stories that both Robyn and you are talking about, right? So that's just one axis. That's only one axis. Within, obviously, we are, we are also part of the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, which has as one of its projects precisely this idea of helping put in place continent-wide infrastructure toward archiving that is not only physical but also is digital. That, of course, is long-term, both short-term and long-term, requires funding, requires what more importantly, I think, which goes back to Robyn's point, what I call archival consciousness, the raising of archival consciousness. That word, which used to be a bad word when we used to talk about political cinema at some point, has never been more useful than it is right now. So there are 1,000 of potential ideas that could be implemented in the process to create. I, for example, one of my fantasies is to have on the African continent on a daily basis something like an archival minute, let's say on radio, for example, on television, for example, yeah, where we would just show one particular moment in the history of the country or the country's relationship to the region or to the continent or to Pan-Africanism or to globalism or to any number of things that precisely would slowly help insert the archival into literally a lived existence, yeah, so there's a multiplicity of axes that we could do, but so one of the most wrap up. Thank you very much. One of the most important things is precisely to keep in touch after this. In other words, after the conference is over, we obviously also have other kinds of lives, etc., which have their own demand. But if we can really create that collective, that alliance, I think the word is even more appropriate. I think there's no doubt that we can draft together some forms of ideas so that we could collectively, with our various connections, network, etc., actually bring into being some radical transformation on the archival map on our continent. And if it is on our continent, it will be in the world as well. So these are some of the ideas that I'd like to share.
Aboubakar, we need an old-fashioned concept. We need a reframing manifesto. But to arrive at that point, yeah. You probably remember all the manifestos.
Yes, many manifestos.
And they're actually quite useful, I think. They're like a shopping list.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, as you said, maintaining contact. So perhaps we could ask Pervaiz if he would create a chat room where these discussions, there's quite a few points from the seminar that I would like to follow up with about the Serbian filmmaker stuff. And so a chat room where these kind of discussions can carry forward and then begin to take shape, under whoever's leadership, not mine.
Very good. We have to wrap up, unfortunately, we passed that time. So I would like to thank you both for both a really exciting presentation and exhortations, shall we say, towards really passing from, obviously, no, there's no theory without practice. There should also be no practice without theory, obviously. And so sort of linking these two aspects in really creating, because it's a really call from the heart that we're hearing, and it just empirical observation across the continent makes it even more urgent for us. So let's do it.